Nothing's changed for all the death that their ideas created. It's just the same fascistic games, but the rules aren't clearly stated. Nothing's really different, cause all government's the same. They can call it freedom, but slavery is the game. There's nothing that you offer, but a dream of last year's hero. The truth of revolution, brother. Brother, 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 brother.
The woke tyrants go on and on and on about privilege. The main culprits they recognize are white privilege, thin privilege, cis privilege, male privilege, and again and again and again, white privilege. I myself spent years rejecting my own, but I recently come to see this issue in a different light. They throw this word privilege around, utterly blind to their own. The problem in this nation is no longer white privilege, like it or not, or any of the other, and in some cases imagined privileges just named. The problem, as I see it, is first world privilege, specifically American privilege. Everyone and anyone who lives in the United States is privileged. I spent close to 11 years of my life homeless on some of the meanest streets of some of the meanest cities in the country. And you know what I learned? That in America, if you are able-bodied and adult and you go hungry, you are not thinking things through. Though, as an aside, I do worry that this abundance we've grown so used to will soon no longer maintain its reliability. Between our general affluence, the innumerable tons of food that we throw away, the various drop-in programs operating in every major city I've ever been to, food stamp benefits and homeless shelters, America is the best fed country in the world. The woke tyrants here grow obese, an addiction celebrated by the body positivity movement, while most of the world starves, and then tell others to check their privilege. As we've seen the rise of a cultural phenomenon known as the victim group, demographics of individuals and communities who claim victimhood and oppression without any evidence outside of their own claims. Women have all the rights that men do. What were once minority groups have all the rights that white people do. The LGBTQ alphabet squad has all the rights that heterosexuals have. They can marry, raise children. They even get preferment in employment. In fact, the various letters are, each of them, members of a protected class. And by the way, there is no such thing as an egalitarian society that even has protected classes. The various social justice causes in America and across the Western world today are by no means fighting for civic equality. They are fighting for supremacy. The idea of so-called privilege has entered the national consciousness through the mainstream media and through these various victim groups who claim they are struggling against a current, failing to realize that it is one with an utter lack of resistance. There is a reason for this focus on privilege. As an activist in the 90s and 2000s within the punk rock subculture, we as a community gave up our own privilege, however we perceived it to exist for each individual. We rejected the benefits of race and affluence particularly. That was the main function of our confrontational appearances. Mind you, this was a time in which America still had systemic racism as well as discrimination against homosexuality. A world in which white privilege was quite real, in which Black America was under the threat of racial profiling and police brutality. However, I stopped fighting those causes when I realized that the inequalities that I had set out to smash had been overcome, and the playing field had been leveled. One could argue, and quite rightly, that the inner city ghetto is just as impoverished as ever, but the barriers preventing upward mobility have been removed. As it stands, a black child born in the ghetto has the same opportunities I had growing up in a trailer park. I realized then what all these victim groups refuse to think about. That any civil rights movement that continues to exist after its objectives have been obtained is no longer fighting for their rights. They are fighting to seize power. And that's just the point. During the 20th century, between the fall of the Romanov dynasty, the rise of Leninist and then Stalinist Soviet Russia, the establishment of Mussolini's fascist state in Italy, the rise of the Third Reich, the Spanish Civil War which divided Spain between the anarchists, communists, and Franco's nationalists, European civilization was shaken to its very foundations. Just as the pervasive spread of communism upset the ancient Chinese Empire and the myriad of other Far East Asian hegemonies. A cascade of dominoes set off by World War I led to revolution, civil strife, and a Second World War. Throughout it all, dynasties and autocracies and empires crumbled, teaching the ruling elites a valuable lesson. To suppress certain popular movements is to threaten society itself. What were they to do about it? How could they control such movements as they occurred in real time? By liquidating the most dangerous and effective elements within and assimilating whatever is left of such movements. It is through these means that they neutralize modern counterculture. Let's look at the 1960s and early 70s in America. That is, the battle for civil rights, the anti-war movement, and the free love revolution. Within that time, we saw such leaders as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party representing the civil rights movement for the blacks. We saw the hippies and college campus radicals waging the anti-war effort. We saw the American Indian movement rise up and take over Alcatraz, fighting against the sins of America's colonial past. We saw student rebellions, the activism of groups like the SDS and SNCC, and the sometimes contentious but often supportive media. The multitudes of that generation were so organized that they had the power to upset the American experiment entirely. But then Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The conflict in Vietnam ended with the withdrawal of troops in 1973 and the shameful debacle at Saigon 2 years later, and the entire movement fizzled out. Now what happened? First, the most effective and threatening elements of the radical culture in America were neutralized. Martin Luther King, assassinated by a lone gunman. Malcolm X, assassinated, apparently, by his own people. The Black Panther Party, the American Indian movement, slated for disruption and destruction by the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover through the machinations of COINTELPRO. The less threatening, less effective elements of the movement were assimilated. The hippies had corporations like Coca-Cola running commercials with the everybody love everybody theme of the hippie peace movement to provide the illusion of change. Major record labels signed deals with acts like Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. They gave the most controllable groups the most representation within mainstream society. The media began siding with their arguments. Even politicians began to choose sides. College administrators capitulated to the popular demand of their students. The revolution had been televised. The revolution had been appropriated. The revolution had been assimilated. The war ended and all the various remaining radicals went out and did exactly what the power structure wanted them to do. They got jobs and became good worker bees. Nothing neuters a rebel like a lack of resistance. When I was in high school, I was a rebel. Still am. I raged against my parents, family, my community, especially my school. During junior year, I got expelled and placed into an alternative school with other students that were just like me. Misanthropic teens unwilling to simply obey. The school had only 2 rules: no drugs, no violence, and it might be assumed that the lack of guidelines would inspire chaos. With new students, it did, but only for a moment. Every last pupil, no matter how unruly or criminally minded they were, eventually conformed and went with the program. When there's nothing to fight against, you put down your fists. This is how those with real power control those without, those who would otherwise rise up against them. You give voice to their movement. You sign their insurgent bans. You have politicians echo their viewpoints, and the threat is duly castrated. What does all this have to do with privilege? Well, if you can convince black people that they are still oppressed through unconscious bias and white privilege, you will have black people hating white people. The plenitude of angry young men and women in ghettos and project housing of the urban jungles sprawled across the country will continue their gangland wars over city blocks they don't even own, blaming the white man instead of uniting against a common opponent, the state. If you convince gays and lesbians that they still face the prejudices of bigoted heterosexuals, you encourage their so-called pride. Encourage their idea that there is accomplishment in an orientation they never chose, and convince them that the means to achieve openness and inclusion is to indoctrinate the youth, an objective the powerful have had for more than a century. If you can convince trans people that they have a history of oppression that they cannot in fact lay claim to, if you can convince them to fight for their right to exist, a right that no one is disputing in the first place, then you embolden them to invade women's spaces, to invade women's sports, and that equality equates to transing the young, creating lifelong customers to the medical industry and big pharma, total corporate tools. The center hub of all this madness, the fuel that keeps the wheels spinning and citizens attacking each other, is the idea of privilege. As I've said, the idea of privilege is becoming a more and more predominant theme within the culture of activism. While white privilege was a minor element, the privilege that activists of the 90s and early 2000s were resisting most was American first world privilege, the one that makes others starve. A privilege most exemplified by and in the hands of the most powerful people on the planet. They tricked us. They used the idea of privilege and remolded it to suit their own agenda and to keep us fighting each other instead of stripping them of power. To keep us divided instead of rendering them useless, superfluous. Having been a revolutionary all those years ago, I was and am still an absolute anti-authoritarian. I oppose oppression and authoritarianism no matter whose face it happens to wear and in what group it happens to manifest within. Today its mask is leftism. Its fighting forces are social justice warriors, Antifa, radical feminism, trans activism, and the LGBTQ movement generally. These so willing victims, those so gladly oppressed brats, gained civic equality long ago. It is not a right to trans kids. It is not a right to infiltrate the schools with pride ideology manifested by bizarre and fetishized perversions. Most homosexuals and lesbians just want to live their lives like everyone else. The truly gender dysphoric do not present their condition as if it were a backstage pass, proving their VIP status. Pride events did not always include perverse, pornographic activities in the broad daylight before the eyes of children. I know. I was there. Elements within the trans community weren't always trying to destigmatize pedophilia. Taking kids to drag shows is not about equality. Talking about sexuality with preschoolers is not about equality. Gender ideology being taught in elementary schools is not about equality. The teacher's so-called right to discuss their personal life within the framework of exposing children to their sexual habits and preferred partner archetypes is not about equality. It's about indoctrination. It's about sexualizing children. It's about the legalization of all and any sexual perversion. It is about destroying the nuclear family, because those who hold the power understand the legal protection that the nuclear family allows its members. With women out of the household along with the men, who raises the child? Those who are already spreading a noxious, tyrannical, fascist ideology. None of this is about equality. This is about control. And the reason these groups do not see it for themselves is because they have all been tricked. Their movements have been usurped by the very powerful, people who care nothing about them, who have an agenda to execute and will cast them off the moment they are no longer necessary or convenient. Revolutions, and this is specifically true of leftist, i.e. Marxist revolutions, eat their own. So long as they can keep us fighting each other instead of them, denouncing each other's so-called privilege instead of rejecting our own, we will never see the threat coming until the barrel is pressed tightly against our heads. I say again, the problem is not white privilege, thin privilege, cis privilege, hetero privilege, but first world American privilege. And the last thing the power structure wants is for us to understand it. For to do so would truly threaten them. So when those woke moralists, those mealy-minded bigots tell you to go check your privilege and cry about the injustices and oppression of a civilization whose various luxuries they are lavishing in, who scream, "Eat the rich," into their iPhones for their mindless social media hordes and ignore how they enrich the billionaire class by doing so, you just ask them, why don't you check yours? Then again, what do I know? I'm just some punk who cares.